By the way, if any context is needed, I played Sonic Frontiers on normal with high speed mode active, so your experience may vary based on the settings you chose at the start of the game. Now, let's get into it. Sonic Frontiers is a game whose greatest strength is also its greatest weakness: its inspiration. The game has a lot of good ideas, but almost none of them are original. It brings very little new, but almost every single idea it takes from elsewhere is a good one. Just to list some quick examples, exploring the overworld for resources and enemies to defeat in order to free your allies and open portals to more dedicated levels is exactly what the Spyro trilogy did. The fights with titanic enemies that you have to climb and scale in order to reach a weak point while they try to shake you off or kill you is just like Shadow of the Colossus. The Cocos and the open world challenges that you do for rewards that increase a handful of your stats with a more ancient, larger version of them are just like the Koroks and Hestu in Breath of the Wild. And on multiple occasions, you just literally play Galaga, except it's a bullet hell now sometimes. There's even an homage to Sonic Spinball of all things, with a segment wherein you have to go and play a game of pinball in order to cause a volcanic eruption. Yes, really. The best of the game's genuinely new ideas come in the form of the different enemies thrown against Sonic, especially the major ones, with the best early example of this being the Squid, an enemy which creates a hard-like path as it flies, where Sonic has to run along mid-air while dodging energy blasts in order to catch and defeat it. But later on, the player will encounter the Sumo, the Tank, the Spider, and others, all of which mix up the gameplay with new mechanics and new ways of defeating them. The game also gains points in replayability, as the nature of a collectathon and a clear communication of the goals in each level encourages completionists, and beating the game unlocks a new arcade mode, wherein players can jump back into each and every act level and play it more like a classic Sonic game via a level select screen. A good map and objective system help the player from getting lost or ever losing track of what they need to do, but more importantly, the player is allowed to progress at their own pace. While the next objective is set and won't change until it's completed, players can choose to progress the game how they want to for the most part. The objective that you have won't prevent you from just exploring to your heart's content, completing challenges, collecting upgrades, playing the dedicated act levels, or even just going fishing and farming for resources and lore. Ultimately, the core gameplay loop will always be the same, revolving around collecting tokens for the relevant character of the island that you're on, gears to access the acts, and the keys to get Chaos Emeralds, which allow you to fight the final boss of that area. And it doesn't matter how early or late one pursues each of those things, or even necessarily in what order some of the time. It's a core loop that emphasizes player freedom, which is perfectly in line with the theme that Sonic himself represents. The level and world design are broken into three pieces. The open world is where the player will spend the bulk of their time, and is by far the most dynamic in how it changes throughout the game. Completing the aforementioned open world challenges will spawn new rails for Sonic to grind on. This means that when a player first shows up, the map and area will be relatively empty, but both will slowly fill more and more with places to go and ways to get there in faster and more interactive ways as the player actually plays the game. This can also create rails that connect from point to point on the map, allowing for the fastest and most efficient method of traversal until players eventually unlock the ability to fast travel if they choose to 100% that area. The static set pieces of the world, meaning the boost pads, springs, launch rings, and other platforms that are always present regardless of what the player does, are also laid out with intent rather than simply at random to fill space. More often than not, completing one of these platforming segments or rail grinds will end with the player landing either in or directly in front of another one. They will also become more interconnected with time as a result of the rails the player creates from the challenges. This creates a marriage of the more rigid yet fast on-rail segments with the action platforming in a way that flows freely as the player decides where to go. The other two pieces are found in the acts, in which the player will find 3D platforming gameplay similar to other modern Sonic games, and 2D side-scrolling gameplay evocative of the classic Sonic formula. In keeping with classic Sonic, the 2D levels are split into several routes based on verticality, with the highest routes being the hardest to stay on but also the fastest with the fewest obstacles. The middle routes provide a balanced experience of things that can get in your way while still retaining some sections that allow the player to cut loose, and the lowest routes are the slowest with the most hazards to punish players who fall off the higher sections either from poor play or being too slow, while also giving them the most time to react to those hazards. This creates a system that encourages growth and good platforming by organically expanding the level and the ways that the player can reach the end goal. It's everything that worked about classic Sonic level design, but now it's tailored to accommodate the new boost mechanics present in modern Sonic games along with the ground pound from this game. The 3D levels operate somewhat as one would expect from anyone that's played Generations Unleashed or the older adventure games. The player is made to run through a long, sprawling track of varied terrain that they have to platform through in order to reach an end goal as quickly as possible, while also taking as little damage as possible. The layout of each level and how the player is meant to traverse it provides some variety, although not at the cost of consistency, meaning that no levels are so different from one another that they seem out of place, and even for those that do push that envelope, it's all justified in world as being a simulated recreation based on Sonic's memories. As a result, though, certain 3D levels noticeably draw inspiration from levels that worked in the past from other Sonic games. The ones that I noticed most were levels inspired by Sonic Adventure 2, namely a level based on Radical Highway, Skyrail, White Jungle, and Green Forest. Admittedly, Sonic Adventure 2 was very fresh on my mind when I played Frontiers, which is why it stood out specifically, but finding them means that in all likelihood there are also other levels designed based on other Sonic games scattered throughout this one. So let me know in the comments section if you found any level design references that you thought were interesting. Considering this is a Sonic game, the game was surprisingly very stable. I never had any sort of problems with freezing, crashing, or screen tearing, or at least nothing that was unintended considering the whole glitchy cyberspace aesthetic the game has going on. Only on rare occasions would I experience some frame dropping, but that was not at all a consistent problem. The two real glitches of the game are an issue with assets clipping through one another, and the game's rendering speed not being able to keep up with the speed of the gameplay. Sonic has a bad tendency to clip inside any enemy that's significantly larger than him, and Sonic will almost regularly clip through Wyvern while the fight plays out normally just because of how the pathfinding works. Giganto also clips his face into his own super attack, and in some circumstances, the camera will just simply clip underground or into cliffs. Likewise, objects in terrain will very frequently pop in and out from nowhere as the player runs around, and in some particularly bad instances, props and other parts of the terrain will literally spawn in next to or underneath the player. None of these things necessarily affect the gameplay in a meaningful way, but based on the limitations of the hardware it was built for, I suppose that's somewhat to be expected. However, while this last thing isn't necessarily a glitch, it does bear weight on how well the game is running. The loading times in the game are fairly long, and while the devs did have the great insight to create a tutorial minigame to tide players over, these slowly lose their ability to cover up the long load times once you've been in them long enough over the course of the game. Worse yet, despite the longer load times and the minigame dedicated to them, there is another loading screen after every single main load instance, which brings into question, why could the two loading instances that directly follow one another not be condensed into one? The most fleshed out aspects of the narrative are the character arcs of the side characters and the greater lore implications of the world building. It's in Sonic Frontiers that we come to understand the Chaos Emerald's origin, why there are ruins everywhere on Angel Island, and even who the progenitors of Chaos, the so-called God of Destruction in the Sonic universe and the villain of Sonic Adventure, were and what happened to them. The game also pays a huge amount of lip service to several other games in the Sonic franchise, making this feel less of a sequel to Sonic Forces and more like a love letter to fans or the culmination of the entire series up to this point. Almost every single major villain or story event from previous games gets referenced as something relevant to that character's experience in the game. And just to rapid fire some examples of what comes up, Knuckles being tricked into being the main antagonist of Sonic and Knuckles, Chaos the Egg Carrier and Tails saving Station Square from Sonic Adventure, the Space Colony Arc incident in Adventure 2, the Black Arms incident in Shadow the Hedgehog, Neo Metal from Heroes, Dark Gaia from Unleashed, Infinite taking over the world in Forces, and almost certainly more things that I missed. Each character apart from Sonic and Eggman ultimately have the same character arc and arc progression. They're captured, released by Sonic, meet with some sort of Coco that has a problem that reflects the interest of that individual character, and after talking with Sonic and resolving the problem with their respective Cocos, they conclude that they need to pursue goals in a way that will cause them to leave a place they've grown accustomed to or comfortable with in order to grow as people. Amy wants to share the love that she feels with the world, which means that she can't just stick around Sonic all the time. Tails wants to prove himself and become a great hero in his own right, so he doesn't feel like a burden to Sonic, or anyone else for that matter, which also means that he can't stay in Sonic's shadow like Eggman would like him to, and Knuckles wants to live freely like Sonic does for a change, and get a life apart from his duty to protect Angel Island. Even Sage, the new antagonist for most of the game, has a similar character arc, wherein she slowly gains more of a soul through her concern for Eggman and her acknowledgement of Sonic that concludes during the final boss fight, where she decides that she must leave her comfortable place at Eggman's side in order to join Sonic and save the world and her creator. Sonic has a flat character arc that allows him to become a foil for all the other characters throughout the game who are actively changing. Sonic is a well-meaning thrill seeker with a passion for freedom and protecting those he loves. It's getting repeatedly introduced to this established character that pushes each of his friends to reach the conclusions of their respective arcs, and what causes Sage to have a character arc at all. Meanwhile, Sage is what causes Eggman to have his arc, his journey beginning almost as they always do, discovering some sort of ancient power that he wants to capitalize on. However, instead of just having him simply lose to Sonic and friends because he's the bad guy, or even repeating the route taken by Sonic Adventure 2, Heroes, and Unleashed, wherein there is now a threat greater than himself that he helped create, the game instead puts Eggman in a position where he's forced to value something other than his own power, genius, and ambition, and lose it. Because with his power, genius, and ambition, he created a program, one that he slowly grows to recognize as incredible, efficient, and adorable. Because of his pride, Eggman required one of his own creations to soften his heart. Nothing else would ever do. And over time, he recognizes that this program wasn't just another of his robots, it had become his daughter. A daughter who, by the end of the game, after just finally coming to terms with, he has to immediately let go of and allow to be destroyed in order to prevent the catastrophe that he himself set in motion. What Sonic Frontiers seemingly did was take every idea that worked in previous Sonic titles, kept what people like, got rid of almost everything else, and used that as the baseline. Many of the game's core mechanics are staple of modern Sonic games: running, jumping, boosting, rail grind, spin dash, homing attack, flying around as Supersonic, springs, boost pads, and going really, really fast. Pure and simple Sonic. Your basic abilities get improved through the aforementioned Coco and challenges. Your attack increases damage dealt to enemies, defense decreases the number of rings lost when getting damaged, ring count can increase your max rings up to 999, and speed does exactly what it sounds like it does. And for the sake of comparison, here is a race between Sonic running the exact same route with no rings at level 1 speed versus no rings and level 99 speed. Although, on that note, while this is playing out, I want to note a pretty severe quality of life problem in that the leveling process does take quite a long time. Not in terms of acquiring the materials or grinding, no, but in terms of the literal leveling process. After checking the footage, I realized that selecting the upgrade I want, watching the animation, waiting for the menu to come back, and then looping that around 70 times, going from level 20 to 99, took around a full half hour of me just sitting in a menu over and over and over again. Which, while it is fair to say that I exacerbated the problem for myself by doing almost all of my leveling in one sitting, it does also mean that regardless of whether you spread it out throughout the gameplay, the game will still be wasting a significant amount of your time in menus, even if that time is broken up. From there, they took the combat and weapons from Sonic Forces and gutted those too, removing all of the weapon abilities and instead adding a parry and a ground pound while refining the combat into combo-based beat-em-up systems with special moves that increase in damage the more the player can land hits on a single target. This combo system is by no means perfect, and many of the combat abilities will overlap in their use case. Essentially, it all boiling down to using ranged attacks to hit things that are threatening to hit you back, using up-close multi-hits to rack up mass amounts of damage when you can, and using the game's new unique mechanic, the Psy-Loop, to strip an enemy's defenses away and make them vulnerable to one of the previous two options. The Psy-Loop is an ability that allows Sonic to leave a trail of energy in his wake which can encircle enemies or objects and hit them with cyber energy. Doing so will create a variety of effects depending on what the player just used it on. With enemies, it inflicts damage to anything inside the loop and then either knocks them down or up into the air, which allows Sonic to both follow up and finish them off. In select circumstances, the Psy-Loop is necessary to make an enemy vulnerable to attack at all, while in others, it's just the most efficient option to use. With objects, the Psy-Loop is officially the when in doubt, just use this option. Psy-looping objects can start mini-boss fights, start puzzles, solve mini-boss fights, get loot, get traversal, get away with murder! It's a Psy-Loop world out there in Sonic Psy-Loop, so always remember to just Psy-Loop. Just Psy-Loop. Just Psy-Loop. Sorry, I don't know what came over me there. The visual fidelity of the game is what you would expect for something that was developed to be a Switch game. It's perfectly passable and looks great in a lot of places, but compromises did have to be made somewhere. Most obviously, although oddly, the frame rate will cut back to 30 max in pre-rendered cutscenes. Whether it's giving tokens to one of the side casts, entering or exiting a portal, grabbing a Chaos Emerald from the pedestal, or worst of all, when performing the big set-piece events as Supersonic during a boss fight. This can create a feeling of gaming jet lag as it constantly switches between smooth actual gameplay and the more sluggish pre-rendered cutscenes, especially during the action-packed boss fights. Much more of an interesting topic, though, is the roller coaster that is this game's sound design. Fans of Breath of the Wild will find themselves very comfortable here, as much of the game's music and sound effects sound almost like they were lifted out of that game's open world and put into this game's open world. Especially the piano flourish every single time a player completes a challenge. It's here that, again, while nothing is bad, it all tends to lack an identity that's unique to this game or unique to Sonic in general. However, it's when we jump into the act levels that things take a turn. The levels all within cyberspace have a distinctly electronic sound that feels synthetic when compared to the nearly ambient natural music of the overworld. Some of the levels even go as far as to dip into full-on dubstep territory, which is playing right now, and what's more, every time Sonic boosts within a level, the music will distort into a more staticky or smeared version of itself as Sonic's speed comes into conflict with the simulation that he's in. The fishing minigame with Big continues this trend, as the tranquility of the fishing spots and the more relaxed tone of the activity are reflected in the electronic music slipping into a calming lo-fi, as it's still in the simulation, but much more relaxed. But then, once you've finally explored the world, done your fishing, and fought your way through the different acts, you finally find yourself face to face with the main bosses keeping you and your friends here as Supersonic. And then this happens.
It's time to face your fears when your time has come and gone. I'll be the one to carry on, and you can throw me to the walls, 'cause now you've untouched me.
Here is where the rock Sonic audio identity doesn't just return in full force, but it goes beyond and cranks the volume and attitude until the knob breaks, skipping clean past the hard rock of Crush 40 and diving headfirst into punk metal, headed by the vocals of Kellen Quinn, the lead singer of Sleeping with Sirens, and co-written by Tyler Smith of Danger Kids, who also make their return from the work on the main theme of Sonic Forces. And finally, after all is said and done, things wrap up for the end credits with the J-Rock outfit 1OK Rock. Which, yeah, okay, dropping the whole professionalism of the video thing, I don't want to know how much of the game's budget was spent on this soundtrack. This is actually pretty stupidly insane. Alright, who thought it was a good idea to have the boss music made by Sleeping with Sirens? Because it's not a good idea. It's an amazing idea, and whoever made that phone call is not making enough money. And on top of that, note that I've been playing on loop, Danger Kids was the best thing about Sonic Forces. I'm gonna stand by that, and I'm so glad they're back. And 1OK Rock is one of like 3 Japanese rock bands I've actually heard of, the other 2 being Man with a Mission and Baby Metal. Honestly, music-wise, they gave me everything I wanted, and everything I didn't know I wanted. And at this point, I'm kind of a little sad we didn't get Crush 40 anywhere. Like, there's so many references to the legacy of Sonic that, I don't know, I feel like we at least had a room for like an homage to them somewhere. If I have to choose, and I do, it's literally my review method, my opinion score, it's a 10 out of 10. But it's the lowest 10 out of 10. So it's gonna be below God of War and Metroid Dread, but higher than Final Fantasy VII Remake. It'd be higher in the 10s, but that Wyvern boss fight was some absolute BS on my first playthrough. I don't care that when I went back and played it after I got really, really good at parrying, I beat it in 10 minutes. That 45 minutes on the first playthrough and then having to give up at 3 in the morning to go back the next day was nonsense, and that really just tilted me off the face of the planet. And I was really disappointed with how much the game draws off other sources instead of trying more original ideas. But honestly, I'm not that surprised, especially after Sonic Forces. Like, I get it. I feel like every Sonic fan has kind of just bullied Sonic Team into submission at this point, because too often they'll try something new, and it's either mid or it flops. And at some point, as something like a creative, as a developer, you have to look at yourself and go, nothing I'm doing is making them happy, so maybe we should just do what everyone else is doing that's making them happy. So it kind of feels like they took everything that worked in other Sonic games and the set pieces they found that people liked online and just used those as the base and then said, alright, what are the most successful other games in the last decade that appeal to the audience? And then after landing on like Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild, they started brainstorming what their favorite games that they're passionate about are, like, from The Office, and they ended up with Galaga, Bullet Hell, Shadow of the Colossus, and Pokemon Ranger for some reason. Which, to be fair, Sonic meets Shadow of the Colossus is another thing I never knew I wanted, because running on and around these giant creatures in order to get at a weak spot and trigger the supersonic fight is one of the best parts of the whole game. But that's just it, though. The sick boss themes, the giant fights, and the way the world opens up as you play, like, it creates the best problem any game can have. I want more! Like, it wasn't a crazy short game or anything, and what's there is awesome. I'm gonna keep playing it. I'm probably gonna 100% it, honestly, if I haven't already by the time this video comes out. But I want more worlds, more terrain, more chapters, more giant boss fights to smack around with Supersonic, more awesome music by Sleeping with Sirens and Danger Kids to listen to after the game ends. I wanted to spend more time watching Sage develop as a character and see how Eggman grows after breaking his own heart. But, I don't know, hopefully this all sets up for like a really cool next Sonic game. Maybe it's even Sonic Adventure 3, who knows? That character development, we'll see. But, that's enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? I'm not gonna lie, this is a pretty important game for me. I say with no lack of gravity that this is probably the most fun I've had playing a Sonic game in 20 years, which I'm only in my mid-20s at the time of this video, so that means a lot. For once, I'm genuinely looking forward to the future of Sonic, and if you're a Sonic fan, you should too. If you made it to the end, please help me grow by subscribing, and as always, I'll see you, yes you, next time.